Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Can I take this opportunity to introduce Gabriel Doherty from UCC Department of History. And Gabriel has very kindly offered to do a lecture, The Look of the Conqueror, Terence MacSwiney and Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. So can I ask you all to give a very warm Kilmurry welcome to Gabriel.
Well, just to begin by thanking the Kilmurry Historical and Archaeological Association and the Independence Museum Kilmurry. I suppose they're distinct organisations, but of course sprung from the same origin, for this invitation, the honour of asking me to address this inaugural Terence MacSwiney weekend. I think it is a fantastic initiative, complements the initiative already demonstrated in the creation of the museum, and I'm sure it will grow from strength to strength, certainly in the 2 years now between now and the centenary of Terence MacSwiney's death, and I know in the years thereafter. So again, thank you and well done. The talk I'll be giving is in essence on the relationship, the similarities and the differences between two of the most famous prisoners, and broadly speaking, more generally two of the more famous Fenians, because I would regard Terence MacSwiney absolutely as in the Fenian tradition, that Cork and Ireland have produced. Terence MacSwiney and Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. I suppose in terms of my own background to the talk, I was closely involved in the centenary commemorations associated with the death of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa and his famous funeral in Glasnevin back in 2015. I've always been interested in Terence MacSwiney also, and the more I studied both men, the more I realised there were points of contact, both personal and ideological, between the two. And I think an exploration of that relationship, both in terms of the points of similarity and difference, shines an interesting light on both men, but I suppose particularly here we're thinking about Terence MacSwiney. Okay, to begin with the title of the talk. Many of you, I know, will be familiar with Terence MacSwiney's play, The Revolutionist. In terms of the origins of this talk, I think some of you may have attended an event in Cork Opera House about 2 years ago, when scenes from the play were reenacted, and speakers also came up periodically during the course of the reenactment to give talks on topics related to the scenes. So this talk originated on that day. I have to confess I didn't do a particularly good job on the day for lack of time. So what I've done is that I've expanded upon that original talk, and hopefully I'll do a better job this time. But this is the scene basically at the end of the play. Who knows, maybe the play will be restaged in connection with the centenary in 2 years' time. But it's in effect the story of a revolutionist, and I think anyone who's familiar with the play will detect that there are certain similarities between the character of the hero Hugh and Terence MacSwiney himself. But these are in effect pretty much the last words of the play, when the hero is dead, and those who he has helped and those who have admired him are around looking at him. And this idea of the look of the conqueror. So Father O'Connor, Nora, let us go now, his beloved. Nora can't take her eyes off Hugh. I could say, look at him forever. Carnegie, another protagonist. I can't feel the gloom until I look away, Nora. It's the look of the conqueror. It's in death that he has conquered his adversaries. 'Tis we who are troubled and frightened, the living. There is no fear on his face. Gone. That's how he would speak. Nora, in effect, has taken over the mantle of Hugh. Nora, they did not heed him, in effect, in life. Those who doubted must come and see him dead. And when I read that scene, it automatically sparked a memory of a writing that I'd come across on Terence MacSwiney. This isn't absolutely clear. I don't know if the people at the back can see it, but I'll read it out just in case you can't. F. MacSwiney's, her introduction to the poems of Terence MacSwiney, despite Fool's Laughter. And when she's talking about Terence's life, his beliefs, and the ideas that informed the poems in the volume. So now and again the hidden fire glowed outwardly, if only for a moment. One such flash I saw as, from the top of a city tram, I watched O'Donovan Rossa, the Fenian convict, drive through Patrick Street in an open carriage on his return from America. Behind his carriage came a small group of those who had gone to welcome him home, and amongst them was Terry. His face was uplifted and shining. So and here's where the idea of the look of the conqueror started to form in my mind. I'd been thinking what a wretched crowd it was, how cold and indifferent the streets, until this glance at Terry startled me. The street, the people, the moving tram on which I sat, all faded. I carried that look with me and wondered what he saw. And then just at the conclusion of the introduction to the volume, on this day 24 years ago, October the 25th, he passed the final single test. It was a simple thing he did, and I hear you, because he was talking about Terence MacSwiney, as simple as his boyhood march with radiant face behind O'Donovan Rossa. For nothing is so simple and peace-giving as loyalty. All the loyal ones who are gone knew that, and many of the living still know, regard that loyalty, despite Fool's Laughter, whence the title of one, despite the fools who mock the principles of those who died. But there's another reference to the contact, both on that occasion and on other occasions, between Terence MacSwiney and O'Donovan Rossa, particularly during the brief interludes that O'Donovan Rossa spent in Ireland upon his returns. So on the 26th of November 1905, so this wasn't the first time O'Donovan Rossa had returned to Cork, I think it was the third time, O'Donovan Rossa came from the United States on a visit to Cork. MacSwiney's remarks were caustic as he watched members of Labour, the United Irish League, the support group as it were for the Irish Parliamentary Party, and conciliation parties, all of whom he considered shams, crowd onto the platform to welcome the old man. He was especially displeased by a speech made by John Daly, a former Fenian himself, for Daly told the people that though they could have freedom sometime, they could do nothing now in the way of fighting for it. To say such a thing, MacSwiney believed, was tantamount to quenching the hope for complete separation in the minds of the people. In fact, would blot out the very thought of it. He remarked that Daly left matters as they were, made no suggestion as to what could be done here and now. Neither did he recall that comparatively soon after such a disaster as the famine, the Fenian spirit awoke, nor point the fact that England herself was gradually weakening. And then you have there the Maureen Shabas in his volume then appends the previous comments made by Annie MacSwiney. So obviously there is an interest that MacSwiney made a point of going to see O'Donovan Rossa every single time he came back to Ireland. And as far as he was concerned, he was in the minority of those who were true to the tradition that O'Donovan Rossa had pioneered or helped to pioneer, and was contemptuous of those who would celebrate the old man in his dotage, as it were, but would dishonour his ideals and practice. But there's other evidence, abundant evidence of Terence MacSwiney's fascination with O'Donovan Rossa and his identification with him as representing one of the purest forms of Fenianism. This is an excerpt from the newspaper that Terence MacSwiney wrote and edited. Didn't last tremendously long, but absolutely fascinating point of study for anyone who wishes to investigate MacSwiney's ideals. So you can see here in November 1914, so this is less than a year before O'Donovan Rossa passes away, but after the war has started. And this is significant for a point I'll be coming to later on. So again, on the basis that it might not necessarily be too easy to read at the back, it's from an anonymous contributor, Finbar, presumably the Cork name, but from New York. So Mr. and Mrs. O'Donovan Rossa have just celebrated their golden wedding and received hearty congratulations from all over the country. Through the courtesy of Mrs. O'Donovan Rossa, we were privileged to pay a visit last Tuesday to St. Vincent Hospital, Staten Island, which is actually where O'Donovan Rossa spent basically his last year and where he died in 1915, and shake hands once more with the grand old man of Fenianism. Before proceeding to the hospital, we had a chat with Mrs. Rossa, about whom a new biography is being made by the great-grandson of the couple, who's a documentary filmmaker in America. And she herself was phenomenally active in the Fenian movement when, in effect, the men were locked up. A network of women, in many cases their sisters or fiancés or wives, stayed together and basically kept the movement going during the 1860s when the men were in prison. And she was, and to a certain extent, it anticipates the Ladies' Land League of the 1880s and the formation of Common Mon 30 years later. So an absolutely fascinating early example of, in effect, the women keeping the show on the road. Before proceeding to the hospital, we had a chat with Mrs. Rossa, who expressed her great delight at the stand taken by the editor of the Irish World, the Robert Ford, against the recruiting campaign of John Redmond. Of course, at the outbreak of war in August, and certainly after the passage of the Home Rule Bill in September of 1914, 2 months before, John Redmond had come out and enthusiastically endorsed the British war effort and said that, in effect, Catholic nationalists should join the war effort as a means of proving their fitness for self-government and guaranteeing home rule at the end of the war. She believed it was exactly what his father would have done, and spoke very highly of the Ford family, saying although her husband and Patrick Ford did not always agree on questions of politics, they had nevertheless remained fast friends. Ross's wife thinks Redmond will soon be Sir John Redmond. As it turned out, of course, Redmond never got the peerage and died in pretty, I suppose, desperate circumstances at the end of the war, just before the end of the war. But feels confident the volunteer movement will produce the proper leader when the time comes. Pretty prescient observation. On our arrival at the hospital, one of the good sisters of St. Vincent took us to the bedside of the Fenian chief of 50 years ago. What memories did that scene recall? The famine, the Phoenix Society, the Fenians, arrests in Dublin, the famous trial and torture of Dartmoor. We had a warm shake hands from Rossa, who was as physically strong as a man of his age could possibly be. He was in mid-80s at this point. But the English prisons have left their mark in his mind. Outside the members of his own family, he knows he does not know anyone, and does not always remember even his own daughters. At times he imagines he is in prison picking oakum, and while we're there he said for the attendant to have his whiskers cut. He keeps pulling the bedclothes, his whiskers, and anything he can lay his hands on after the fashion of picking oakum. We talk to him of the volunteers and Redmond's treason, but Rossa will never know of Redmond's treachery. He talks of going to Ireland and Skibbereen. It is well, perhaps, after all, he does not remember some things. It was not to make Ireland an England province that Rossa suffered the torture of the damned. If John Redmond got control of the volunteers, Rossa would have lived in vain. But the lessons of Rossa's life will always remain as an inspiration to the volunteers to work for Ireland and Ireland only. In saying goodbye, we forgot ourselves and spoke in English, but the response to the old thing was Slán Lata Vúcail. The mere fact that this article is reproduced is evidence, again, that MacSwiney is very conscious and very proud of MacSwiney, even in his dotage. It's also proof of that dotage, that by 1914, O'Donovan Rossa was suffering probably from senile dementia, partly traumatised, of course, by the remembrance of what he suffered during his time in prison, and simply wasn't in the position to comment on anything, let alone current affairs. And that's significant for what we'll be talking about later on. Okay, so who was O'Donovan Rossa? Why was it that Terence MacSwiney found him such an inspirational figure? Were there any aspects of the men's parallel careers which they had in common? Were there any aspects that differentiated them? Well, these are, as far as I can see, the main headings of O'Donovan Rossa's life. I always hate to reduce anyone's life to a series of headings, and if anyone is interested, I give a talk on O'Donovan Rossa that lasts about 3 hours, so I can expand upon these if necessary. But certainly what I've done is, in terms of, I've put asterisks where I think that there are clear points of comparison and certainly an underline where I think there is a clear point of difference. O'Donovan Rossa was born into Gaelic cultural milieu in West Cork. He was thoroughly immersed in it. He was a fluent Gaelic speaker. Anyone who's read any of his writings will be familiar, as it were, of the influence of Gaelic patterns of speech and style on those writings. He wrote in a distinctive Hiberno-English style. Clearly, Terence MacSwiney was also a passionate Gael, very passionately committed to the revival of the language, used it wherever he possibly could. Of course, by this stage, certainly in Cork City, a thoroughly Anglophone centre, that was extremely difficult. But certainly, this shared commitment to the sense of a distinctive Gaelic culture as the fundamental basis and aim of the campaign for separation was something they shared between them. Family is a point of difference. I mean, O'Donovan Rossa was there, front and centre, a spectator in Skibbereen, as a witness of the awful scenes in Skibbereen. He was about 13, 14 through to 15, 16, 17, from 1845 to 1848, 1849. I would always argue they're probably the crucial years in terms of you're starting to form political ideas and a sort of a general impression of the world. And at that decisive point in his life, he's witnessed to some of the most horrific scenes the human eye can ever have seen. Terence MacSwiney couldn't see them. I mean, he wasn't born. And as a consequence for all that, MacSwiney was absolutely conscious of the famine and read about it and was very bitter, as of course O'Donovan Rossa was, about how the British government had treated Ireland during the famine. I don't think he could quite have that personal point of contact that somebody who was sort of a victim themselves of the famine. Fenianism clearly is a point of contact. They are both Fenians. We probably tend not to use the term Fenian to describe the revolutionary generation, but I would argue that's incorrect. I mean, they are absolutely in the mainstream of Fenian thought, and there is absolutely a clear point of continuity between the very origins of the Fenian movement, and I would argue that O'Donovan Rossa is actually a Fenian before Fenianism is even created. He creates the Phoenix Society even before the IRB itself is created, albeit he becomes a member of the latter. And the IRB remains in existence, of course, and goes through various travails and ups and downs in the period between the 1860s and 70s and 1916, but the underlying principles remain the same. So from that point of view, the shared Fenianism of the two is a clear point of contact. Probably the obvious, the most important, most salient point of contact between the two is their time in prison. O'Donovan Rossa wasn't the first political prisoner, Irish political prisoner. Certainly someone like John Mitchell, his famous jail journal, and we'll be coming back to Mitchell later on in the talk, could lay claim to that. Of course, people like Wolfe Tone had been in prison, but that was more, as it were, as a precursor to their trial rather than for their offences. But O'Donovan Rossa, I think, is the most famous prisoner. He is the most punished prisoner in British penal history. He actually succeeds in committing prison offences while he's being punished for other prison offences. I think the record at some point, I think he was being punished 3 times for 3 separate offences. The British ran out of calculations as to exactly what you should do to a prisoner like that, because the idea that somebody will be committing multiple offences simultaneously wasn't something that they even factored into their punishment regime. And of course, remember, this is always at a point where he had no reason to believe he was going to be released. He had been sentenced to life in prison for penal servitude for treason felony. And so this defiance of the British regime in prison, as far as he could only have believed, would end in his death sooner rather than later. Terence MacSwiney, I would argue, is probably the most famous Irish political prisoner since O'Donovan Rossa. There had been others, of course, many others. You could argue that somebody like Thomas Ashe sort of has a claim to that title as well. And I was closely involved with the centenary of Thomas Ashe commemoration last year, and another phenomenal figure he was. But simply by virtue of, I suppose, the position that MacSwiney held, certainly as Lord Mayor, but also, of course, as in command of the volunteers in Cork, gave him a status that even somebody like Thomas Ashe, at the time of his death, didn't have. So that experience of political imprisonment is a shared one. Now, there are differences even there. MacSwiney died on hunger strike. O'Donovan Rossa didn't go on hunger strike. Hunger strike at that point, it's really an invention of the suffrage movement in the years prior to the First World War. You did have prisoners who went on hunger strike in the 19th century, but they were regarded simply as being insane. The idea of somebody consciously as a political tactic resorting to hunger strike wasn't something that anybody really conceived as being possible. And it really is with the suffrage campaigners that it starts to be developed and refined, and it's brought to perfection, arguably, through Terence MacSwiney. I should also, of course, immediately also append that one should never forget Fitzgerald and Murphy in Cork Jail, who, of course, are on the hunger strike at the same time as Terence MacSwiney, and I think it's a little unfortunate. Sometimes their memory is overlooked, and I know that I think the MacSwiney family would absolutely be conscious of the role that those men played here in Cork while Terence was on hunger strike in Brixton. The two men are also exiled. I mean, O'Donovan Rossa is told, get out of Britain, you're not going back to Ireland. When you get out of jail, you can go anywhere, you're not going back to Ireland. You can go to Australia if you want. He decides to go to America and spends sort of the rest of his life with the brief interlude that he'd come back to Ireland, actively campaigning in advanced physical force circles in America. Terence MacSwiney also briefly was exiled under the Defence of the Realm Act in 1917. Of course, he marries in England precisely because he had been exiled there. He wasn't allowed, under the Defence of the Realm Act, he wasn't allowed to go back to Ireland at that point. So, of course, the exile is different. In effect, for O'Donovan Rossa, it's lifelong. But the idea of the British government telling an Irishman they couldn't go back to Ireland was a point that was common to the two. The big difference between the two is the dynamite campaign. This is, if O'Donovan Rossa's time in jail was the zenith of his reputation and his responsibility and his credibility, and in effect made his name for the rest of his life, the dynamite campaign almost destroys that reputation. In effect, he's advocating for dynamite attacks on British cities, and both on civilian and military targets. It was a campaign that led him to be utterly marginalised, even within physical force circles, even within the Fenian movement. He was regarded as being on the absolute most extreme wing. So people like Devoy and Stevens came out very forcibly against him. There is nothing comparable in the record of Terence MacSwiney. He is, in effect, a fighter himself, and was much more of an advocate of sort of an open, as far as he would, I think he would say, an open, fair fight. But it's interesting that, notwithstanding the fact that Terence MacSwiney and everybody else at the turn of the 20th century was conscious of O'Donovan Rossa's advocacy of campaign, they didn't reject him or repudiate him. That Terence MacSwiney, even though that wasn't his modus operandi, he still believed that that wasn't, as it were, all that there was to say about O'Donovan Rossa, and that there was a sort of a more fundamental truth that he represented, to which they could subscribe, even if in MacSwiney's and many other people's cases they couldn't contemplate going to the extreme of the dynamite campaign. And then, of course, you also have the death and funeral as a point of contact. O'Donovan Rossa's funeral in Glasnevin Cemetery on the 1st of August 1915 is arguably the touch paper that lit the fuse for the 1916 Rising. It is the occasion where Porrick Pearse makes his famous Grayside oration that culminates in the phrase, "They've left us our Fenian dead, and so long as Ireland hold these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." And of course, Terence MacSwiney's own funeral was a huge, a very controversial funeral. The British interfered with it in a way that they hadn't done with the O'Donovan Rossas or hadn't done with Thomas Ashes. I think they realised that MacSwiney's funeral, having learned the lesson of what had gone wrong in not interfering with O'Donovan Rossa and Ash, they are absolutely determined that MacSwiney's funeral will proceed along the lines that they determine, rather than the lines determined by his sympathisers. So, in looking at the life of O'Donovan Rossa as a whole, there are many points of similarity. Some stronger than others, and again, I would think that the period in prison is in effect the defining point of both men. But there is also a very clear point of difference on the issue of the dynamite campaign. Okay, so just very quickly, just looking at this funeral, because it is something that, again, MacSwiney is present at. So he dies on Staten Island on the 29th of June 1915. There's this tremendously emotive scene when the body is put on the ship in New York to go over to Liverpool. All the Irish dockers turn out on the dockside in New York, and the ship leaves in complete silence with the guard of honour provided by the Irish dockers. When it arrives in Liverpool, this is after the Lusitania, so the decision was taken that ships would just go as fast as they possibly could to safe British waters. Of course, we know from the sinking of the Leinster, the centenary of which is just happening now, that wasn't always safe. The Irish dockers in Liverpool do exactly the same thing as the ship comes in. The body is taken off, the casket is taken off the ship, it isn't allowed to touch English soil, and then it's put back on the boat to Dublin. As the ship leaves Liverpool, again the Irish dockers turn out as the guard of honour, and when the ship pulls into Dublin port, the Dublin dockers pull out. So, as it were, a very emotive thing. You can imagine the atmosphere produced by huge crowds and complete silence. So funeral mass in Dublin's Pro Cathedral on the 29th of July, and that in itself was significant. Remember, there had been, to put the points on this, some very deep problems between the Fenian movement and the Roman Catholic Church, and you had occasions where Fenians had been denied church funerals, and we'll be coming back to one of those. So I would always argue that is one of the sort of more significant aspects of the O'Donovan Rossa commemoration, or his burial, is that he's not just given a church funeral, he's given the mother of all church funerals. In effect, he's given the state funeral by the Catholic Church, and this is a crucial moment in, as it were, in advancing the healing of the rift between the advanced nationalist movement and the Catholic Church, and I think that was an absolute prerequisite for the successful War of Independence some years later. And then buried in Glasnevin on the 1st of August. So this is the Cork Brigade, or representatives at the funeral, and here you have Tomás McCurtain, and here you have Terence MacSwiney. So MacSwiney, again, makes a point of being at that funeral. He had constantly paid attention to O'Donovan Rossa in life. He had studied his works. He had met him as frequently as possible, had at least seen him. He had reported on his dying days in America, and now he makes sure that he is going to be present at his funeral. It's a very good shot, I think. Now, this is a very famous booklet that was produced in conjunction with the O'Donovan Rossa commemoration. Some of you may have it. A duplicate copy was produced by Glasnevin Cemetery 2 years ago, for those who were lucky enough, including myself, to be in Glasnevin at the state commemorative ceremony. And it is absolutely fascinating because one can look at the articles by Pearce, by Arthur Griffith, by James Connolly, by MacDonagh, and a number of others. And it is, as it were, a snapshot of the Republican movement, as it were, on the cusp of committing to the 1916 Rising. So as a document not just of the O'Donovan Rossa funeral, but as it were, as a testament of faith of those who are about to go onto the streets in Dublin, it has a unique value. But it isn't the only book that's produced by the O'Donovan Rossa Funeral Committee. There is another one which we'll be coming to in a second. Now, there was a controversy about the funeral, and it comes back to the point that we were discussing earlier on about the report of O'Donovan Rossa being, in fact, senile and not really knowing what was going on. Mary O'Donovan Rossa, his widow, wrote in that book, in effect, that repudiating the report that her husband had gone soft in his dying days and had turned into a Redmondite. There were a report that appeared in the Daily Telegraph. The last time I saw Rossa, he was tottering on the brink of the grave. When I die, he said to me, "You might tell the English people I have fought a good fight according to my views, and long ago lost all hatred, let alone prejudice, against the British government. He hoped the Irish would stand united in helping fight Germany, the common enemy of civilization." And even though Mary Jane repudiated this, in the report on the funeral in the Irish Examiner, on the day after the funeral, in effect, placed the Home Rule Act on the statute book Now, as we've already seen, just in November 1914, you'd had a first-hand account of somebody who'd spoken to Mary Jane and had tried to speak to O'Donovan Rossa, and the man wasn't simply capable of understanding. He wasn't even in prison at that point, let alone being aware of what was happening globally, let alone endorsing John Redmond. Now, this is where there's a sort of slight technical thing. We have to exit this for a second, and on the occasion of the centenary of the funeral, Glasnevin Cemetery, along with the Irish Government, staged a commemorative ceremony. Glasnevin Cemetery, I think, have done a fantastic job over the last number of years in terms of dealing with the various different demands upon it from various different political constituencies. This is John Green, who I know, but on this occasion, I have to say, and I told him myself, I think he made a major misjudgment, because in effect he repeats the line that was spoken at the time. So I just have to get out of this and go to here.
In 1894, and again a decade later in 1904, he journeyed back to Ireland. On his second visit, he even managed to visit the Fenian graves of Glasnevin. He may not have been the wholly unrepentant Fenian. In an interview disputed with a Daily Telegraph journalist, he said he had long since lost all hatred of the British government, and that he lamented rather than boasted of his part in the doctrine of assassination. Even his friends and the societies in West Cork were astounded when he endorsed Redmond and Home Rule.
Which he didn't. So just to get back to the presentation, I just have to get back to the... It just takes a second or two just to load, and I'll get back to the screen. Just take a quick break. I just have to quickly... Okay, so this was unforgivable on the part of John Green, and I said so politely to him when I met him, because Mary Jane herself had included a repudiation of that claim in the booklet which we've just seen, and Glasnevin Cemetery itself had reproduced that booklet in conjunction with the centenary commemoration. So this is her handwritten letter, July the 22nd. She was in the Gresham at this point. My husband, O'Donovan Rossa, was, as he said of himself in the dock, an Irishman since he was born, and I can testify that during his last long illness, he was the same unconquerable Irishman, breathing the same unalterable desire for the absolute freedom of his country and its utter separation from England that he breathed in the dock. In effect saying, this is propaganda, this is wartime propaganda, it wasn't true. Okay, so what significance does this have for Terence MacSwiney? Well, this is the second book that is produced in conjunction with the O'Donovan Rossa funeral. It's not anything like as well known as the other volume. I'm not quite sure why not. I struggled to find it myself. But it is written by one, Terence MacSwiney. And it is absolutely fascinating because it's an exploration of O'Donovan Rossa's life, and it shines any number of lights on MacSwiney's own thinking, again in what it says and what it doesn't say. It's relatively brief, 16 pages, but I mean, he'd had to write this in basically a month, get it published, and it's dated the 27th of July, which is around the time of the controversy regarding this false report. So, for the remainder of the talk, we're just going to be having a look at some of the extracts from this. I'm not going to be showing the whole thing, and just exploring what it tells us about Terence MacSwiney as much as about O'Donovan Rossa. He begins with this thing like, this has driven him nuts. I mean, he is absolutely scandalised that this lie, and he sees it clearly as a lie, besmirches the memory of O'Donovan Rossa in death. That somebody who has not sort of bent the knee during life, in death is in effect co-opted into the British imperial war effort. England's chief weapon and again I'll read it for the benefit of people at the back, England's chief weapon in the long struggle with Ireland is the English lie. Every Irish nationalist knows this, and every Irish nationalist ought to know it is a weapon for use, unscrupulous, treacherous, far-reaching and deadly. Most of us thought we had comprehended the English lie, and some of us prided ourselves on not underestimating it. But till Rossa died, not one of us had the exact measure of its possibilities. And now we can only know that there are infamies in hell which we cannot fathom. We henceforth must be ready against every surprise of hell. And hell, and this is the English government, and is regarded as hellish. For hell is the source of the lie. From the agony of his prison, Rossa cried out, "They can lie like hell." And even then, with all the revelations that revolted the world about O'Donovan Ross's treatment and torture, the world, we did not or nor realise that this was literally and exactly true. That black and infamous as the pit from which their inspiration comes, they can lie like hell. Now this gives you an indication of the depth of MacSwiney's outrage against what has happened, against the memory of somebody whose life he clearly treasures, and against an outrage of his own principles. But now when Ross's body is hardly cold in death, the lies flashed across the Atlantic that not only was he reconciled to England, but he even called to us to fight for her as he died. And we begin to realise that the lie like hell is unfathomable. Our answer is the fit answer. We rally to the graveside of the heroic dead and show we are not deceived. And by that graveside, it would be fit also to repeat what Rossa said and wrote, that those who are not heard may now be wise. To the good people at home who cancelled surrender, he wrote, "I am sorry that I forfeit the esteem of any of my people on account of my firm adherence to the principles of my life." In effect saying, he, as his widow testified, he died as he had lived to the same principles. Yet despite of the Masterlight comes forth to proclaim that Rossa yielded at the end, but we nail the Masterlight with Rossa's own words. "I have made no peace with England, I am at war with her, and so help me God, I will wage that war against her till she is stricken to her knees, or till I am stricken to my grave." And again, I don't think you can read those words without simultaneously reading Terence MacSwiney's own death. But there are many other, as it were, points in the book where it foreshadows MacSwiney's life, and to a certain extent I think is an indication that his life is moulded by the spirit that he admires as being distilled in O'Donovan Rossa. So why did he do what he did? A few ways may be said of the motive and spirit of Rossa's resistance, since his friends at first tried to dissuade from him. And again, this is absolutely fascinating when thinking forward to MacSwiney's own resistance in prison to the overtures to have him take food. He saw that his jailers were bent on humiliating him in the hope of crushing his spirit, and says, "I determined that there was one man who would go to his grave, but before he gave them the satisfaction of seeing they could lash him into submission by insult, chains and bread and water." His resistance was studied, well planned and kept up with astonishing perseverance. This could be words exactly applied to Terence MacSwiney himself. The preserving of his spirit unbroken required that he should fight. His temperament made it so, and in the spirit and character of his resistance, his temperament is clearly seen. And here then there's a slight distinction between the two. Here's a contrast to John O'Leary. O'Leary had all the restraint and dignity of a Roman Stoic. He scorned to argue with the enemy. I think that's probably a better description of Terence MacSwiney. But Rossa had that irresistible disposition that he must not only act up to, but speak out the truth that is him or die. To argue with his jailers brought him punishment. He took every punishment rather than be silenced. He and O'Leary were equal in constancy, though the character of their constancy made such contrasts. And here's just the point about the end about John Mitchell's praise for O'Donovan Rossa. Kickham too was amongst others paid Rossa his tribute. From his estimate as genuine as Mitchell's, Charles Kickham, the author of Knocknagow, we can take one word which sums up perhaps more aptly than any other single word can be used to sum up the character of Rossa. Indomitable. And again, if you wish to apply exactly that descriptive terms to Terence MacSwiney, I think it would apply equally well. Here's where he deals with the issue of the relationship with the church. A further consideration of Ross's character, and again I think this says as much about MacSwiney's attitude towards the changing opinion of the church in 1915, as evidenced by the fact that it was giving O'Donovan Rossa this very big funeral, as it did about the attitude of the church during the Fenian times. While he had the resolution of a man, he was as open as a child. He was frank with everyone and perfectly candid in stating his views. He was seen that where injustice had to be met, he would speak his mind at any cost. And this characteristic appears frequently when there was trouble with the priests over the Fenian oath. Rossa always resented the charge that they were irreligious and fought with anybody and everybody who brought it forward. He stated the simple truth, he said, those who are banded together for a fight for civil and religious liberty would be the first to stand in defence of their faith if any foe threatened their altars, in the sense that Irish Republicans were not French Republicans. They did not attack the church. What they wished to achieve was freedom for their country, and if their church was attacked, they would defend their church as much as they would defend their country. On the question of the oath, he always held with the view of John O'Mahony, expressed in his correspondence which Rossa published in his recollections. O'Mahony wrote in 1859, our association is neither anti-Catholic nor irreligious. We are an Irish army, not a secret society. We make no secret of our objects or designs. We simply bind ourselves to conceal such matters as are needful to be kept from the enemy's knowledge, both for the success of our strategy and the safety of our friends. I hold that I do not exceed the bounds prescribed by my religion when I swear this, nor shall I ever tax my conscience with it in the confessional. In the sense, we are soldiers. We are doing our job as soldiers. Our oath is, as it were, the oath that any soldier will take, and in much the same way as a soldier will not reveal to the enemy any information that could be useful to the enemy, neither will the Fenians divulge to the British anything which they could use. And in effect, he's saying that is, and we are being, as well, misunderstood by those who think that our oath enables us to be described as a secret society, along the pattern of some of the anti-clerical revolutionary groups on continental Europe. He said, we're not, we are fundamentally different. And here, again, this is this personal description, coming back to the point I mentioned earlier on. I myself saw Ross in his old age going up to his Easter duty in the Cathedral of Hull. And the picture I have him in my mind then, taken with that picture he gives himself of his childhood, makes for me a perfect picture of consistent life. Rossa never wavered in his allegiance to God or country. He could speak for 8 hours together in defence of his faith, as did at his trial, but he could also condense his faith into a line as in this: I believe in God, but I defy the devil. And again, there's a certain overtones there of Pierce's Grace Adoration, where he says that in this place we fight against evil. If we all have a faith as pure as Ross's and act up to it with as fine a constancy, Ireland shall have no need to despair. So in MacSwiney's mind, there is, as it were, no incompatibility. Now, I think there is a difference there. I think with Rossa, I think there's an awful lot of pre-famine Catholicism, and to a certain extent there's almost a little bit of post-Vatican II Catholicism, where he says the church is the church of the people and not just the institutional church. I think MacSwiney's perhaps a little bit more sort of the devotional revolution, post-famine reconstruction of the church. So there are, I think, differences in their religious outlook. But the fact that they were both religious, both devout Catholics, expressed in different ways and at different times, I think is undeniable. I think last night, CATHAL may have spoken on that subject. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend, so can't speak. Okay, so what is his lesson? This is how he concludes. He goes, what lesson do we draw from the life of O'Donovan Rossa? And again, this is so pertinent to a discussion of his own character. And what is the conclusion in the lesson to be drawn from Rossa's life? It lies in that word of Kickham's, indomitable. Whether we mobilise in our armed thousands to receive his remains, his spirit cries to us, be indomitable. And that resolution shall be informed and fixed in every heart if we have caught the inspiration from his soul as we march through the grave with his body, which we are privileged and proud to guard. And we should remember that oath of his to make no peace with England as a sacred pledge true to his faith. Believe in God, but I defy the devil. A renunciation of English rule as a sacred necessity, like to his baptismal bonds to renounce the devil and all his works and pomps. This is literal truth. Rossa hated English tyranny as Mitchell hated it, and like Mitchell, he made no compromise. And again, it's so interesting when one thinks of the pantheon of Irish political prisoners, that here you have O'Donovan Rossa, quoting Mitchell, and MacSwiney, in effect, citing O'Donovan Rossa. But like Mitchell too, there was no malice in his heart more than another child. He never nursed a personal wrong. Even before he left the shadow of Chatham prison, he could write like this to a sympathiser and apparently an Englishman. I should wish to see Irishmen and Englishmen friends as well as neighbours. No course of life will ever find me fostering ill will between Englishmen and Irishmen. And again, there's absolute consistency there with Terence MacSwiney. One of the most inspirational quotes I find in MacSwiney's book, Principles of Freedom, it's a book full of inspirational ideas, is where he says, from the heart of the enemy, genius cries. He said that at the heart of English culture, there is a genius that is equal to Ireland's, the genius at the heart of Irish culture. And he said it is in that cultural area, at the human level, that the two neighbours can and should meet as equals. But at the political level, where you have a sense of one dominating the other, that is where the conflict must arise. And so this is how he finishes up. And again, this is, if one thinks of his own life, it's this pretty sort of powerful prose. Whatever checks we may receive, for however long, we have run one ground that can never be lost. And the question of Irish freedom is but a question of time. Be indomitable. The battle will come, and with the promise of Ireland's freedom, would we not all pray to survive and proclaim her victory, to assert her greatness, to build up anew the foundations of her glory. That is something to live for, the goal of a life's ambition. But in the battle, some must fall. Be indomitable. And who can be sure which is the better part, to live or die? Think of Rossa gone to join the spirits of O'Leary, whom he revered, and Kickham, whom he loved, and all their comrades. And think of the gathering to meet them of the noble spirits of the earlier years, the martyrs of many a persecution and the heroes of many a field, in effect the faith and fatherland notion. We can imagine them gathering together to await the issue of the last fight. Why then pray either to stand or fall, when either way we are happy? But pray for courage and constancy. And if we survive, we shall rejoice in putting Ireland, as Layla dreamed, at the head of nations. And if we fall, our spirits, rising from another battlefield, shall be found worthy to enter what must surely be one of the noblest companies of heaven. Now, if anyone wants to understand what drove MacSwiney to go through the agonies of hunger strike, I think you can't find a better expression of that. He said, whether I live or die, the victory is secure. And it is in that perseverance that there is the ultimate victory. And that, to me, is one of the best descriptions I can find of not a life of O'Donovan Rossa, which it is intended to be, but of MacSwiney's own psychology. To conclude, the most famous quote, which isn't necessarily, I think, necessarily the best thing he ever wrote, but certainly the most famous quote from, of course, taken from his inauguration speech. Sorry, these are some of the quotes from Principles of Freedom, just before we get to the conclusion. Now, you cannot read any of these without thinking of O'Donovan Rossa and himself. The common error that a man's work for his country should be based on the assumption that it should bear full effect in his own lifetime. And again, he's saying that's the legacy of O'Donovan Rossa, is that he lived constantly to his end, that he has carried on the phoenix flame and has passed the baton. Some will never survive to celebrate the great victory that will establish our independence. Yet they shall not go without reward, for to them will come a vision of soul of the future triumph, an exaltation of soul in the consciousness of labouring for that future. Let any argument be raised against one such pioneer. He knows this in his heart, and it makes him indomitable. And there is no coincidence whatsoever that phrase indomitable is one which he applies to O'Donovan Rossa, and which one he applies here. And it is he who is proven wise in the end. When his hand falls dead, his glory becomes quickly manifest. He has lived a beautiful life and has left a beautiful field. He has sacrificed the hour to give service for all time. He has entered the company of the great, and with them he will be remembered forever. And this is, again, a similar quote. And again, as most of you will know, you can quote pretty well any page in the book. It must be clear to all that Ireland can against some of her banded armies. There will be abundant need for men who will stand the single test. As O'Donovan Rossa survived the single test in prison, and as MacSwiney was to face the single test in Brixton prison. 'Tis the bravest test, the noblest test, and 'tis the test that offers the surest and greatest victory. For one armed man cannot resist a multitude, nor one army conquer countless legions. But not all the armies of the empire of earth can crush the spirit of one true man. and that one man will prevail. And it's clear that as far as he was concerned, O'Donovan Rossa represented the spirit of that one man, and I think as far as history is concerned, MacSwiney in his time also proved to be that man. And so to the conclusion. Well, me and my wife had a very big argument last night as to whether I should include the word fanatically there. She was saying, no, fanatic is excessive, it's over the top. I actually don't think it is. I think if you are, how can anyone be overly committed to truth, to what they believe is truth? She was suggesting put passionately or something like that, but whichever descriptive term that you use, O'Donovan Rossa was clearly a historical figure, although not just a historical figure, in whom Terence MacSwiney read so much of his own life. He believed, I think to a certain extent, certainly during his prison, he models himself on what O'Donovan Rossa did. So what was the influence? Well, I think absolutely you can read the most famous quote associated with the life of Terence MacSwiney as a reflection on the life and achievement, and in some cases lack of them, of O'Donovan Rossa. It is not those who can inflict the most, but those that can suffer the most who will conquer. In effect, O'Donovan Rossa's life is evidence of both. There were times when he inflicted, there were times when he suffered. The Dynamite Campaign is the period when he is seeking to inflict on others, and it is a complete failure. In fact, it is so complete failure that it nearly destroys, as it were, the good that had accrued to O'Donovan Rossa's name during his life. But it is when he suffered during his period of imprisonment, that was the success. And I think of all the figures in recent Irish history, O'Donovan Rossa would have been the one who most fitted, as it were, the test case of doing both. And I think that one can interpret that comment, at least in part, as it were, as Terence MacSwiney's learning the lessons of O'Donovan Rossa's life. And so we come back to the point where we began, and this idea of in death, triumph. Death is triumph. That it is in maintaining constantly to the end, and the look on the conqueror that victory should be sought, and it is those who are left behind, not those who have fought the fight and have passed on, who are troubled, but they shouldn't be, because the inspiration is there. We'll leave it there.
I'd like to thank Gabriel very much for a most insightful lecture. Gabriel has another appointment, so needs to sort of shoot off. But does anyone have any quick questions for him?
Could I just make a particular point? Because in my talk last night, I showed Terence MacSwiney's writings, and I made reference to one that I hadn't seen, which we now have seen, his writing on O'Donovan Rossa. So absolutely, I think this is iconic, I think it's brilliant, and very much appreciated.
Thank you. I should just explain, I'm a mentor to the Douglas Camogie Club's under 4, 5 and 6s team, and they have their blitz this afternoon, and I have to be on the sideline to shout at them, otherwise they'll just go off and wander off. So unfortunately, I absolutely hope to try and get to the Mass tomorrow. I also know that Douglas, I think, are playing Kilmurry themselves later on this afternoon, so best of luck to Kilmurry, but perhaps slightly better luck to Douglas as well. Thank you. I absolutely wish I could stay, but I think my babies, or like 20 or 30 of them, would kill me if I wasn't there.
All right, He always said, we are, we will be. And MacSwiney, who read Davis, of course, and Davis was one of his heroes, also came from that same school of writing. The poet should be the one to rouse us must be passionate, and his passion will win us heart and soul. When literature is not passionate, it does not touch the spirit to lift and spread its wings and soar to finer air. So you find in MacSwiney's prose some of the lyric quality of his poetry as well. So there is an attempt here to really infuse this whole argument with, as I say, the lyrical quality of his own poetry. So this is the standard MacSwiney set for himself as a poet. He goes even further, basing his ideals of manhood and the persona or speaker he constructed for himself in his poetry on, among others, Thomas Davis, Theobald Wolfe Tone, and John Mitchell. They were some of the people, particularly Wolfe Tone, that he so admired. He says, "Get to understand our great ones and you will find them human, gay and lovable. We swear by Wolfe Tone for his manly virtues. We love him because we say to ourselves, what a fine fellow for a holiday." That's how he felt about Wolfe Tone. You'd like to spend time with him. He goes on to say, "We are influenced not by the man who always wants to preach a sermon to us, but by one with whom we would go for a holiday. Our history makers are great, joyous men of fine spirit, fine imagination, fine sensibility, and fine humour." So he's not just talking about poetry here, he's also talking about what he sees as the ideal heroic figure. So they're not dull men who preach at you, they're fine figures, lads you'd like to spend time with, go for a holiday with. They're full of fun, they're joyous. He says they loved life, they loved their fellow man, they loved all the beautiful, brave things of earth. And he goes on to justify why they should be joyous. He says, "It is because we must talk of grave things that we must preserve our gaiety. Otherwise, we could not preserve balance. Only the solemn man is dull. We need only be natural to bring back joy to serious endeavour." In MacSwiney's view, if we put literature before the people, it should, as I said before, or as MacSwiney said before, arrest attention, strike the imagination, give a grip on reality, and fill them with joy in life. MacSwiney saw himself as a poet giving voice to the revolution. That's what the poetry was doing. Most poets we're familiar with, have more than one theme. They write of many things. And as I read MacSwiney's poems, I was wondering, did he have any other themes? In his own writing, he believed that all of it was devoted to the revolution, and I've discovered in a way that he was right. He does write of other things. He writes of the beauty of the Irish landscape. For instance, He also writes about women and their place in the world of his time. He writes often of the heroes and martyrs of Irish history and mythology. But these themes are always used to give extra weight to the voice of the revolution. The Irish landscape, he argues, is one worthy of freedom. The place of women is at the side, or sometimes, I'm afraid, behind their men as they fight for Irish freedom. The great heroes of the past, like the historical Robert Emmet or the mythological Fionn, are celebrated for their courage and self-sacrifice in the cause of Irish freedom. For MacSwiney, in his poetry, the revolution does not need to be argued. So you never find arguments for it in his poetry. It justifies itself. So he begins there, not saying we need it. It's just there. It is a given. All we need to do is give it utterance. Give it utterance greatly, he says. He believed that his fellow writers were afraid of the revolution. To enter the arena of greatness, they must give the revolution a voice. That is the vocation of the poet. So he's very single-minded in this. There is one purpose to this, one driving force. The vocation of the poet is to give voice to the revolution. He will not be careless of form, so never think that MacSwiney ignores form. He does know how to write poetry. He is skilled in that area, so he doesn't ignore it. But more important to him is the passion. And it's the passion in him that will make simple words burn and live. And we see this in every line of the poetry. So he goes on to claim even further for the poet. The poet is the prophet of tomorrow. Because of his sensitiveness, he knows every heart and gives a voice and song to all. That's a huge claim. But Davis was making the same claim. The great romantic poets, the great late romantic poets like Keats and Shelley and Byron were doing the same. They were saying that the poet's soul was so sensitive, that their minds were so in tune with their fellow man, that they could speak for everyone. So MacSwiney was never speaking for himself. He was speaking for the whole Irish nation. Even if they didn't know themselves, he knew them, and he could give voice to them. And he's full of certainty about that. That's one of the things that so inspires me about his writing. There's no doubt in his work. He doesn't doubt the revolution. He never feels he even has to justify it, or to justify himself in his ability to speak for everybody. Some of the lines that he uses, the opening lines of Battle Cries, that collection that came out in 1918, the first poem in the collection of the same title gives us a flavour of what MacSwiney meant about the poet being a prophet, and one whose insight allowed him to see into the hearts of all Irish men and women, and to their deep, if unspoken, desires. He presented himself as the all-knowing voice of the hidden desires of the people. He knew their hearts, and as importantly, he could see into the future. So these are a couple of the opening lines from that poem. Glory to God, we shall not die without another blow. Glory to God, the living flood is sweeping all below. The flame has cleft the darkness, the old and fierce desire. He even swept the slave into a white and burning fire. 'Tis no mad dream, I hear the thread of countless marching men. Old Ireland is ablaze in city, field and glen. To arms the cries goes down the wind, and with a wild delight we rush to arms and pray, Godspeed another gallant fight. We shall not perish off the land in dastardly disgrace. Glory to God, we'll do a deed worthy of our royal race. And again, you'll see what I've been talking about here. It's we will do this. We can see into the future. We are going to do deeds that are worthy of this beautiful nation. And keeping in mind our time schedule that's going on around here, I will conclude with MacSwiney's own estimation of the value of what he describes as the true poet. He may not be a hero in his own time, but because of his courage and the beauty and passion of his words, he will achieve immortality. And he says further, the true poet would pass, leaving to the foe that hated him heartily, equally with the friend that loved him well, the wonder of his thought and the rapture of his melody. And I'm going to say those words just one more time, because this is what MacSwiney believes should be his legacy, which is what we're experiencing here today, 100 years later. He says, the true poet would pass, leaving to the foe that hated him heartily, equally with the friend that loved him well, the wonder of his thought and the rapture of his melody. And I would advise you all to read his poetry, because for me, that's where the heart of the man lies, in the poetry. And all of that certainty and that belief, remembering always that he's a man of his time, not a man of our time, but a man of his time, speaking of a nation that was in the trouble that Ireland was in from that period, in the early years of the 20th century. So I think we're going to have our readers now, and I think you have them all lined up in the order in which they're going to perform.
And going to call on Catherine MacSwiney Brewer and Breen MacSwiney to come up to the front to read, please.
Great.
The women of Ireland. They never failed us in the hour when Ireland fought and fell, and how they took their martyrdom, let Ireland's story tell. Now Ireland stands to front the foe in battle once again, and Ireland's women, quick with pride, leap forward with the men. But not as men with blow for blow a mission they divine, where through the battle's heat they press along the battle line. Not weaponed, though the danger's rife, through fire at duty's call, they pass with undefended breast to where the wounded fall. But undiscerning death is there, and they must pay the toll. They brave the terror with the men, and with them fill the roll. O Ireland will remember all when sounds her victory, the crown her women with her men in proudest liberty. I'll just read one more short poem called Fragment. The stream, the heathery slope, the field of corn, the unpretentious cottage in the vale, the rich red earth, seed-bearing, full of joy, tells of the golden promise soon to be. Where shall I be in the autumn when the flower is waving o'er these fields? Thank you.
The sunlight on our steel. We have seen a new and vivid gleam, and drunk a wondrous hope. Glory beyond the mountain's beam that bathes the mountain slope. O God, how deep our hearts are thrilled, what joy our spirits feel, what radiance keeps our voices stilled, the sunlight on our steel, the naked, shining steel, the liberating steel, guard of the free for liberty, O cherish still the steel. We cherished in our hearts a dream, in visions shaped the goal, but oh, we hungered for a gleam to cheer the longing soul. We wearied out the patient skies, their promise to reveal, till heaven flashed to exulting eyes, the sunlight on our steel, the naked shining steel, the liberating steel, guard of the free for liberty, oh cherish still the steel. And in the splendour of its rays, our freedom we have won. Ireland in glory all ablaze, stands proudly in the sun. O God, we pray before our land fetters again shall feel. The foe must meet us, hand to hand, the sunlight on our steel. The naked, shining steel, the liberating steel, guard of the free for liberty, O cherish still the steel.
Finally, I'd like to call on CATHAL, MacSwiney Brewer, to read one of his grandfather's poems.
The Prophecy of Fionn. It all shall be set down, and in the memory of the aftertime, our day shall shine with all the glow of dawnlight, the dream and hope of morning. Bardic song shall sing a sweeter triumph than the host. By braver host o'erthrown, and reverent ears shall bend to hear of hero dreamers' battles. While pulses quickening, leaping hearts, eyes listening, tell how a people cherish a last hope. Stern there shall stand a warning to the world, where dark deeds triumph for a little day. Beware the dreamer. When a wandering soul inspires a dauntless heart, a mind acute, a hand both strong and quick to strike, beware, let tyrannies then tremble. There shall flash like quickening fire through the quivering earth a message to all nations, like a star shattering an ocean darkness, like a song bearing its burden in a single line. A few men, faithful and a deathless dream, rouse to the sound, the freedom of a race, and strike slave souls to fire. Awaken, earth! No people shall despair who hear it told from mourners' men, so passed the power away.
I would like to thank Mary and all our readers. I think those poems give an indication of the themes that Mary was referring to. We have one last part for this session. We commissioned a poem from John Fitzgerald, a local poet. John's a neighbour of mine, and he writes very eloquently about people and place. He is the university librarian at UCC, and he's been writing since 2010 only. But in 2014 he received the prestigious Patrick Kavanagh Prize for Poetry, and in 2015 was shortlisted for the Hennessy New Irish Writing Award. John is unfortunately in China, so is unable to read his own poem, which was the original plan. So he's written a short introduction, which I'm going to read first, and then I'm going to read his poem. And there'll be copies if people would like a copy of his poem to take away. It's a newly commissioned work, it's never been heard before. So in the introduction, John says, on 12th of August 1920, Terence MacSwiney was arrested and accused of sedition for having in his possession a piece of paper on which was written a cipher key for use in decoding secret RIC messages. 4 days later, on the 16th of August, he was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment in Brixton Prison. He immediately went on hunger strike in protest. When I was asked by Deirdre Burke to write a poem for this event, I went to the Cleric Stone to think about Terence MacSwiney, a son of Kilmurry and a poet himself. The stone is an outcrop of rock found in a field near Polnaragus, Kilmurry, and decorated with megalithic-era inscriptions or rock art. The detailed patterns and marks on the Cleric Stone are indecipherable to us. The poem doesn't seek to make any political statement, simply to register the existence of this unique stone in our midst, the extraordinary courage of one of our own, and the perpetually unresolved question of self-sacrifice, itself a kind of cipher. And the poem is called Cipher. At first sight, a brow, head recumbent, face staring at the clouds. Gaining, a stooped figure, head bowed, arms embracing something wide. On close approach, 2 stones. No, only one. A model plateau and mountain range. Flapping whiskey label, trampled sandwich packaging. The cup marks like corries. The whole massive, almost oval, waist high. A step on the western side. Broad sloping flank to the north. Shear marks. Crevices. A long natural gash. On the southern side, moss, lichen, stonewort in the holes, soiled water lodged in a sunken cirque, calcified bird droppings, quartzite white, a battered, opaque yogurt container, the surrounding field inclining up to clearock, thick grass free of weed, trees deckling the ridge. A dog barks. I keep the familiar horizon behind me, read the creases and hollows with smooth, clean hands. Circles, grooves, gutters, diagonals, a strange rib cage. I am a drone over a stone land. I step back to take a photograph. The flat western face, like an aged cetacean, the blown grass silvering mystically, as clouds part to release a raven into the throat of the valley. Map, memorial, message. And was it worth it? Pastoral peace as far as the eye can see, relative sustainability, the island divided but not ungovernable when we put our minds to it, some residual sense of the Gaelic, independent still, despite tyrannies of prayer, power and progress. Your bravery didn't save the day, or the world, or you, but you knew the power of fear and empire, and that your courage would make us think about things like pride, resilience, everything you forfeited in that cell, so that we could figure it out for ourselves. Read the signs, get the message, even if it still makes no sense.